Chapter 1 of A Birding on a Bronco by Florence A. Merriam. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Birding on a Bronco by Florence A. Merriam. Prefatory Note. The notes contained in this book were taken from March to May 1889 and from March to July 1894 at Twin Oaks in Southern California. Twin Oaks is the post office for the scattered ranch houses in a small valley at the foot of one of the Coast Ranges, 34 miles north of San Diego and 12 miles from the Pacific. As no collecting was done, there is doubt about the identity of a few species, and their names are left blank or questioned in the list of birds referred to in the text. In cases where the plumage of the two sexes is practically identical and only slight mention is made of the species, the sexes have sometimes been arbitrarily distinguished in the text. Several of the articles have appeared before, in somewhat different form, in the Auk, the Observer, and Our Animal Friends. All the others are published here for the first time. The illustrations are from drawings of birds and nests by Luis Agassiz Fuertes and from photographs taken in the valley, together with some of eucalyptus trees from Los Angeles, for the use of which I am indebted to the courtesy of Dr. B. E. Furnow, Chief of the Division of Forestry of the United States Department of Agriculture. In the preparation of the book I have been kindly assisted by Miss Isabel Eaton, and have received from my brother, Dr. C. Hart Merriam, untiring criticism and advice. Florence A. Merriam, Locust Grove, New York, July 15, 1896. Chapter 1. Our Valley. "Climb the mountain back of the house and you can see the Pacific," the ranchman told me with a gleam in his eye. And later, when I had done that, from the top of a peak at the foot of the valley, he pointed out the distant blue mountains of Mexico. Then he gave me his daughter's saddle horse to use as long as I was his guest, that I might explore the valley and study its birds to the best advantage. Before coming to California, I had only known the birds of New York and Massachusetts, and so was filled with eager enthusiasm at thought of spending the migration and nesting season in a new bird world. I had no gun, but was armed with opera glass and notebook, and had Ridgway's manual to turn to in all my perplexities. Every morning, right after breakfast, my horse was brought to the door, and I set out to make the rounds of the valley. I rode till dinner time, getting acquainted with the migrants as they came from the south, and calling at the more distant nests on the way. After dinner I would take my camp stool and stroll through the oaks at the head of the valley for a quiet study of the nearer nests. Then once more my horse would be brought up for me to take a run before sunset, and at night I would identify my new birds and write up the notes of the day. What more could observer crave? The world was mine. I never spent a happier spring. The freedom and novelty of ranch life and the exhilaration of days spent in the saddle gave added zest to the delights of a new fauna. In my small valley circuit of 1.5 miles, I made the acquaintance of about 75 birds, and without resort to the gun was able to name 56 of them. My saddle horse, a white Bronco who went by the musical name of Canello, had been broken by a Mexican whose cruelty had tamed the wild blood in his veins and left him with a fear of all swarthy skins. Now he could be ridden bareback by the little girls, with only a rope noose around his nose, and was warranted to stand still before a flock of birds so long as there was grass to eat. He was to be relied on as a horse of ripe experience and mature judgment in matters of local danger. No power of bit or spur could induce him to set foot upon a piece of boggy land, and to give me confidence one of the ranchman's sons said, "Wherever I've killed a rattlesnake from him he'll shy for years," and went on to cite localities where a sudden violent lurch had nearly sent him over Canello's head. What greater recommendation could I wish? If the old horse had had any wayward impulses left, his Mexican bit would have subdued them. It would be impossible to use such an iron in the mouth of an Eastern horse. They say the Mexicans sometimes break horses' jaws with it. From the middle of the bit, a flat bar of iron, 3/4 of an inch wide, extended back 4 inches, lying on the horse's tongue or sticking into the roof of his mouth, according to the use of the curb. There was no other rein. The bit alone weighed 16 ounces. The bridle, which came from Ensenada in Lower California, then the seat of a great gold excitement, was made of braided rawhide. It was all handwork. There was not a buckle about it. The leather quirt at the end of the reins was the only whip necessary. When I left the ranch, the bridle was presented to me, and it now hangs behind my study door, a proud trophy of my Western life, and one that is looked upon with mingled admiration and horror by Eastern horsemen. Canello and I soon became the best of friends. I found in him a valuable second, for as I had anticipated, the birds were used to grazing horses, and were much less suspicious of an equestrian than a foot passenger, and he found in me a movable stake, constantly leading him to new grazing ground. For when there was a nest to watch, I simply hung the bridle over the pommel and let him eat, so getting free hands for opera glass and notebook. To be sure, there were slight causes of difference between us. He liked to watch birds in the high alfalfa under the sycamores, but when it came to standing still where the hot sun beat down through the brush and there was nothing to eat, his interest in ornithology flagged perceptibly. Then he sometimes carried the role of grazing horse too far, marching off to a fresh clump of grass out of sight of my nest at the most interesting moment, or when I was intently gazing through my glass at a rare bird, he would sometimes give a sudden kick at a horsefly, bobbing the glass out of range just as I was making out the character of the wing bars. From the ranch house, encircled by live oaks, the valley widened out and was covered with orchards and vineyards, enclosed by the low brush-grown ridges of the coast mountains. It was a veritable paradise for the indolent field student. With so much insect-producing verdure, birds were everywhere at all times. There were no long hours to sit waiting on a camp stool, and only here and there a treetop to sky the wandering birds. The only difficulty was to choose your intimates. Canello and I had our regular beat, down past the blooming quince and apricot orchard, along the brush-covered side of the valley where the migrants flocked, around the circle through a great vineyard in the middle of the valley, past a pond where the feathered settlers gathered to bathe, and so back home to the oaks again. I liked to start out in the freshness of the morning when the fog was breaking up into buff clouds over the mountains and drawing off in veils over the peaks. The brush we passed through was full of glistening spiders' webs, and in the open the grass was overlaid with disks of cobweb, flashing rainbow colors in the sun. As we loped gaily along down the curving road, a startled quail would call out, "Who are you, eh? Who are you, eh?" And another would cry, "Quit!" in sharp warning tones, while a pair would scud across the road like little hens, ahead of the horse, or perhaps a covey would start up and whir over the hillside. The sound of Canello's flying hooves would often rouse a long-eared jackrabbit, who with long leaps would go bounding over the flowers to disappear in the brush. The narrow road wound through the dense bushy undergrowth, known as chaparral, and as Canello galloped round the sharp curves, I had to bend low under the sweeping branches, keeping alert for birds and animals, as well as Mexicans and Indians that we might meet. This corner of the valley was the mouth of Twin Oaks Canyon, and was a forest of brush alive with birds, and visited only by the children whose small schoolhouse stood beside the giant twin oak from which the valley post office was named. Flocks of migrating warblers were always to be found here. Flycatchers shot out at passing insects. Chewinks scratched among the dead leaves and flew up to sing in the branches. Insistent vireos cried, "To-whip, to-whip, to-whip, to-wee," coming out in sight for a moment only to go hunting back into the impenetrable chaparral. Lazuli buntings sang their musical round. Blue jays, blue squawkers as they are here called, went screaming harshly through the thicket, and the clear ringing voice of the wren tit ran down the scale, now in the brush, now echoing from the boulder-strewn hills above. But the king of the chaparral was the great brown thrasher, his loud rollicking song and careless independent ways, so suggestive of his cousin the mockingbird, made him always a marked figure. There was one dense corner of the thicket where a thrasher lived, and I used to urge Canello through the tangle almost every morning for the pleasure of sharing his good spirits. He was not hard to find, big brown bird that he was, standing on the top of a bush as he shouted out boisterously, "Kick it now, shut up, Dorothy, Dorothy," or, calling a halt in his mad rhapsody, slowly drawled out, "Whoa no." After listening to such a tirade as this, it was pleasant to come to an opening in the brush and find a band of gentle yellow birds leaning over the blossoms of the white forget-me-nots. There were a great many hummingbirds in the chaparral, and at a certain point on the road I was several times attacked by one of the pugnacious little warriors. I suppose we were treading too near his nest, though I was not keen-eyed enough to find it. From high in the air he would come with a whir, swooping down so close over our heads that Canello started uneasily and wanted to get out of the way. Down over our heads, then high up in the air, he would swing back and forth in an arc. One day he must have shot at us half a dozen times, and another day, over a spot in the brush near us, probably where the nest was, he did the same thing a dozen times in quick succession. In the midst of the brush corner were a number of pretty round oaks, in one of which the warblers gathered. My favorite tree was in blossom and alive with buzzing insects, which may have accounted for the presence of the warblers. While I sat in the saddle watching the dainty birds decked out in black and gold, Canello rested his nose in the cleft of the tree, quite unmindful of the busy warblers that flitted about the branches, darting up for insects, or chasing down by his nose after falling millers. One morning the ranchman's little girl rode over to school behind me on Canello, pillion fashion. As we pushed through the brush and into the opening by the schoolhouse, scattered over the grass sat a flock of handsome black-headed grosbeaks, the western representative of the eastern rosebreast, looking in the sun almost as red as robins. They had probably come from the south the night before. As we watched, they dispersed and sang sweetly in the oaks and brush. In the giant twin oak under whose shadow the little schoolhouse stood was an owl's nest. When I stopped under it, nothing was to be seen but the tips of the ears of the brooding bird. But when I tried to hoot after the manner of owls, the angry old crone rose up on her feet above the nest till I could see her round yellow eyes and the full length of her long ears. She snapped her bill fiercely, bristled up, puffing out her feathers and shaking them at us threateningly. Poor old bird! I was amused at her performances, but one of her little birds lay dead at the foot of the tree, and I trembled for the others, for the school children were near neighbors. Surely the old bird needed all her devices to protect her young. One day I saw on one side of the nest, below the big ears of the mother, the round head of a nestling. It was pleasant to leave the road and to ride out under the oaks along the way. There was always the delightful feeling that one might see a new bird or find some little friend just gone to housekeeping. One morning I discovered a bit of a wren under an oak with building material in her bill. She flew down to a box that lay under the tree, and I dismounted to investigate. A tin can lay on its side in the box, and a few twigs and yellowish-brown oak leaves were scattered about in a casual way. But the rusted lid of the can was half turned back, and well out of sight in the inside was a pretty round nest with one egg in it. I was delighted. Such an appropriate place for a wren's nest, and sat down for her to come back. She was startled to find me there, and stopped on the edge of the board when just ready to jump down. She would have made a pretty picture as she stood hesitating, with her tail over her back, for the sun lit up her gray breast till it almost glistened, and warmed her pretty brown head as she looked wistfully down at the box. After twisting and turning, she went off to think the matter over, and encouraged perhaps by my whistle, came back and hopped down into the little nest. 2 weeks later, I was very much grieved to find that the nest had been broken up. A horse had been staked under the tree, but he could not have done the mischief, for while the eggs were there, the nest itself was all jumbled up in the mouth of the can. I could not get it out of my mind for days. You become so interested in the families you are watching that you feel as if their troubles were yours, and are haunted by the fear that they will think you have something to do with their accidents. They had taken me on probation at first, and at last had come to trust me, and then to imagine that I could deceive them and do the harm myself. When Canello and I left the brushy side of the canyon and started across the valley, the pretty little horned larks, whose reddish backs matched the color of the road, would run on ahead of us, or let the horses come within a few feet of them, squatting down ready to start, but not taking wing till it seemed as if they would get stepped on. Sometimes one sat on a stone by the roadside, so busy singing its thin, chattering song that it only flitted on to the next stone as we came up, for it never seemed to occur to the trustful birds that passers-by might harm them. One of our most interesting birds nested in holes in the open uncultivated fields down the valley. The burrowing owl, known popularly, though falsely, as the bird who shares its nest with prairie dogs and rattlesnakes. Though they do not share their quarters with their neighbors, they have large families of their own. We once passed a burrow around which 9 owls were sitting. The children of the ranchmen called the birds the how-do-you-do owls, from the way they bow their heads as people pass. The owls believe in facing the enemy, and the Mexicans say they will twist their heads off if you go round them times enough. One of our neighbors milked his cows out in a field where the burrowing owls had a nest, and he told me that his collie had nightly battles with the birds. I rode down one evening to see the droll performance, and getting there ahead of the milkers, found the bare knoll of the pasture peopled with ground squirrels and owls. The squirrels sat with heads sticking out of their holes, or else stood up outside on their hind legs, with the sun on their light breasts, looking, as Mr. Roosevelt says, like picket pins. The little old yellowish owls who matched the color of the pasture sat on the fence posts, while the darker colored young ones sat close by their holes, matching the color of the earth they lived in. As I watched, one of the old birds flew down to feed its young. A comical little fellow ran up to meet his parent, and then scudded back to the nest hole, keeping low to the ground as if afraid of being seen or of disobeying his mother's commands. When the ranchman came out with his cows, the small owls ducked down into their burrows out of sight. Romulus, the collie, went up to the burrows, and the old owls came swooping over his back, screaming shrilly. The milkers told me that they often struck him so violently they nipped more than his hair. When the owls flew at him, Romulus would jump up into the air at them, and when they had settled back on the fence posts, he would run up and start them off again. The performance had been repeated every night through the nesting season, and was getting to be rather an old story now, at least to Romulus. The ranchman had to urge him on for my benefit, and the owls acted as if they rather enjoyed the sport, though with them there was always the possibility that a reckless nestling might pop up its head from the ground at the wrong moment and come to grief. It would be interesting to know if the owls were really disturbed enough to move their nest another year. When Canello and I faced home on our daily circuit of the valley, we often found the vineyard well peopled. In April, when it was being cultivated, there was a busy scene. All the blackbirds of the neighborhood, both brewers and redwings, assembled to pick up grubs from the soft earth. A squad of them followed close at the plowman's heels. Others flew up before his horse, while those that lagged behind in their hunt were constantly flying ahead to catch up, and those that had eaten all they could sat around on the neighboring grapevines. The ranchman's son told me that when he was plowing and the blackbirds were following him, 2 or 3 bee birds, as they call the Arkansas and Cassin's flycatchers, would take up positions on stakes overlooking the flock, and when one of the blackbirds got a worm, would fly down and chase after him till they got it away, regularly making their living from the blackbirds, as the eagles do from the fishhawks. One day, in riding by the vineyard, to my surprise and delight, I saw one of the handsome yellow-headed blackbirds sitting with dignity on a grapevine. Although his fellows often flock with redwings, this bird did not deign to follow the cultivator with the others, but flew off and away while I was watching, showing his striking white shoulder patches as he went. The distinguished birds were sometimes seen assembled farther down the valley, and I once had a rare pleasure in seeing a company of them perched high on the blooming mustard. The son of the ranchman told me an interesting thing about the ordinary blackbirds. He said he had seen a flock of perhaps 500 fly down toward a band of grazing sheep, and all but a few of the birds light on the backs of the sheep. The animals did not seem to mind, and the birds flew from one to another and roosted and rode to their heart's content. They would drop to the ground, but if anything startled them, fly back to their sheep again. Sometimes he had seen a few of the blackbirds picking out wool for their nests by bracing themselves on the backs of the sheep and pulling where the wool was loose. He had also seen the birds ride hogs, cattle, and horses, but he said the horses usually switched them off with their tails. On our way home we passed a small pond made by the spring rains. Since it was the only body of water for miles around, it was especially refreshing to us, and was the rendezvous of all our feathered neighbors. How they must have wished it would last all through the hot summer months. As I rode through the long grass on the edge of the pond, dark water snakes often wriggled away from under Canello's feet, but he evidently knew they were harmless, for he paid no attention to them, though he was mortally afraid of rattlers. I did not like the feeling that any snake, however innocent, was under my feet, so would pull him up out of the grass onto a flat rock overlooking the pond. In the fresh part of the morning, before the fog had entirely melted away, the round pool at our feet mirrored the blue sky and the small white clouds. If a breath of wind ruffled the water into lines, in a moment more it was sparkling. Along the margin of the water was a border of wildflowers, pink, purple, and gold. On one side stood a group of sycamores, their twisted trunks white in the morning sun and their branches full of singing birds, while away to the south a line of dark blue undulating hills was crowned by the peak from which we had looked off on the mountains of Mexico. The air was ringing with songs, the sycamores were noisy with the chatter of blackbirds and bee-birds, and the bushes were full of sparrows. There was an elder on the edge of the pond, and the bathers flew to this and then flitted down to the water, and when they flew up afterwards, lighted there to whip the water out of their feathers and sun themselves before flying off. I never tired watching the little bathers on the beach. One morning a pipit came tipping and tilting along the sand, peeping in its wild, sad way. Another time a rosy-breasted linnet stepped to the edge of the pond and dipped down daintily where the water glistened in the sunshine, sending a delicate circle rippling off from its own shadow. Then the handsome white and golden-crowned sparrows came and bathed in adjoining pools. When one set of birds had flown off to dry their feathers, others took their places. A pair of blackbirds walked down the sand beach, but acted absurdly, as if they did not know what to do in water. It was a wonder any of the birds did in dry California. 2 pieces of wood lay in the shallows, and the blackbirds flew to them and began to promenade. The female tilted her tail as if the sight of herself in the pond made her dizzy, but the male finally edged down gingerly and took a dip or two with his bill, after which both flew off. On the mud flats on one side of the pond, bee-birds were busy fly-catching, perching on sticks near the ground and making short sallies over the flat. Turtle-doves flew swiftly past, and high overhead hawks and buzzards circled and let themselves be borne by the wind. Swallows came to the pond to get mud for their nests. A long line of them would light on the edge of the water, and then, as if afraid of wetting their feet, would hold themselves up by fluttering their long pointed wings. They would get a little mud, take a turn in the air, and come back for more, to make enough to pay them for their long journeys from their nests. Sometimes they would skim over the pond without touching the surface at all, or merely dip in lightly for a drink in passing. At others they would take a flying plunge with an audible splash. Now and then great flocks of them could be seen circling around high up against a background of clouds and blue sky. One day I had a genuine excitement in seeing a snow-white egret perched on a bush by the water. I rode home full of the beautiful sight. But alas, my story was the signal for the ranchman's son to seize his gun and rush after the bird. Fortunately, he did not find him, although he did shoot a green heron, but it was probably a short reprieve for the poor hunted creature. Canello was so afraid of miring in the soft ground that it was hard to get him across some places that seemed quite innocent. He would test the suspicious ground as carefully as a woman, 1 foot at a time, and if he judged it dangerous, would take the bits, turn around, and march off in the opposite direction. I tried to force him over at first, but had an experience one day that made me quite ready to take all suggestions in such matters. This time he was deceived himself. We were on our homeward beat, off in the brush beyond the vineyard. I was watching for chewinks. We came to what looked like an old road grown up with soft green grass, and it was so fresh and tender, I let Canello graze along at will, while keeping my eyes on the brush for chewinks. Suddenly Canello pricked up his ears and raised his head with a look of terror. Rattlesnakes or miring, it was surely one or the other. When I felt myself sinking, I knew which. I gave the horse a cut with the quirt to make him spring off the boggy ground, and looked off over his side to see how far down he was likely to go, but found myself going down backwards so fast I had to cling to the pommel. I lashed Canello to urge him out, and he struggled desperately, but it was no use. We were sinking in deeper and deeper, and I had to get off to relieve him of my weight. By this time his long legs had sunk in up to his body. On touching the ground, I had a horrible moment, thinking it might not hold me, but it bore well. Seizing the bridle with one hand and swinging the quirt with the other, I shouted encouragement to Canello, and straining and struggling, he finally wrenched himself out and stepped on terra firma. I never appreciated the force of that expression before. The poor horse was trembling and exhausted when I led him up to high ground to remount, and neither of us had any desire to explore boggy lands after that. On our morning round, Canello and I attended strictly to business, he to grazing, I to observing. But on our afternoon rides, I, at least, felt that we might pay a little more heed to the beauties of the valley and the joys of horsebacking. Sometimes we would be overtaken by the night fog. One moment the mustard would be all aglow with sunshine. At the next, a sullen bank of gray fog would have risen over the mountain, obscuring the sun which had warmed us and lighted the mustard, and in a few moments it would be so cold and damp that I would urge Canello into a lope to warm our blood as we hurried home. End of chapter 1.